Hello dear students, welcome to BAJIRAO IAS Academy. Today is 8th May 2024 and we have few important articles from the Hindu to discuss in today's class. So first of all, let's try to solve yesterday given practice question. Yesterday I've given one practice question with respect to the Shaksgam Valley. And this Shaksgam Valley we have already discussed because China has been building road across the Shaksgam Valley and India strongly protested China building such a road across the Shaksgam Valley because in 1963 through an agreement Pakistan ceded this Shaksgam Valley to China. So therefore India still objects Pakistan ceding territory to China because India considers the Gilgit-Baltistan including Shaksgam Valley is an integral part of India. Now the correct answer for this question is B, north of Karakoram watershed. Okay, so B is the correct answer. Shaksgam Valley is situated to the north of Karakoram watershed. Now if you can look at the location of these different places, so understand that where this Shaksgam Valley is located. Shaksgam Valley is located exactly at this place, okay, north of the Union Territory of Ladakh. Now this is where the Karakoram is located. It is north of Karakoram. The Shaksgam Valley is north of the Karakoram, and this is Gilgit-Baltistan. And also you can identify the Nubra Valley here. So therefore the Shaksgam Valley is north of the Nubra Valley, and at the same time the northeast of Gilgit-Baltistan and even north of the Karakoram watershed region. So therefore you can also see the Aksai chain, and Shaksgam Valley is also west of Aksai chain. So therefore the correct answer is B. Today's practice question: which of the following committees recommended 27% reservation for OBCs? So the committees given here are Santanam Committee, Mandal Commission, Sacha Committee, or Justice Rohini Commission. So please try to answer this question in the comment section and I'll be providing you the correct answer in tomorrow's class. So please also understand, we have discussed about the reservations for Muslims in the OBC category, and one particular committee has recommended 27% reservation for 27% reservation for OBCs. So therefore try to answer this question. We have already discussed in our previous classes. So today we have few important articles. We'll try to discuss one by one. So first important article is with respect to the West Nile fever. Now Kerala on alert as man dies of West Nile fever. So this was in news. Now what was the context? So we'll understand the context first, and then we'll understand what was this disease and what was its symptoms and how we can prevent this disease. We will understand gradually. Now what was the context? Context is that the Kerala state government has actually issued an alert. Okay, so the alert with respect to the West Nile fever. So against the West Nile fever, a mosquito-borne viral disease. So this West Nile fever is actually a mosquito-borne viral infection. Because of this virus, 1 death and 8 cases of West Nile virus have already reported in Kozhikode, Malappuram and Thrissur districts of Kerala. And because of this reason, Kerala government on high alert with respect to the West Nile fever and its contamination. Now what were the basic symptoms of West Nile fever? So West Nile fever, if it is infected to any individual, then the individual would show the following symptoms. He would have high fever, headache, neck sickness, disorientation, stupor, coma, tremors, muscle weaknesses and paralysis. So he would show all those symptoms once he gets infected with the West Nile fever. And in fact, most of these symptoms are also similar to that of a Japanese encephalitis. So this is also another disease similar to the West Nile fever. So whatever symptoms the infected individual would feel after the infection of West Nile fever, the same symptoms can also be observed in the Japanese encephalitis. And in fact, total 80% of the patients need not show any symptoms. Once the West Nile fever is infected, the infected individual may not show these symptoms. It actually happens with the 80% of the people. And in fact, the disease is spread by a mosquito called Culex species of mosquitoes. So these Culex species of mosquitoes actually spread the disease from one place to one individual to the another individual, because these mosquitoes actually act as a host and they transmit this disease from one person to another person. And in fact, the World Health Organization has also said that the human infection is most often is a result of bites from the infected mosquitoes, especially the Culex species of mosquitoes. So human beings are infected with this West Nile virus is because of the bites of infected Culex mosquitoes. And this actually happens when they feed on the infected birds which circulate the virus in their blood for few days. However, the other thing that you have to understand, there is no human to human transmission in this West Nile virus. Okay, so it is not contagious in nature, but Culex mosquitoes can actually act as a host and spread the disease from one person to another person, but human to human transmission is not possible in the West Nile virus. Now, apart from that, how West Nile virus transmission cycle actually looks like? So actually birds act as a reservoir host for this West Nile virus. So if Culex mosquitoes bites these birds, then the virus spreads from birds to the mosquitoes. And again, the mosquitoes bite birds, then this would spread to the birds, animals, and even the human beings. Okay, so this is how West Nile virus transmission cycle actually looks like, but human to human transmission of this virus is not possible. Most of the infections as per World Health Organization is because of the bite of the Culex species of mosquitoes. And other important features of this particular West Nile virus is that, so in fact, there was no vaccine is available for this West Nile vaccine. However, what are the measures that the Kerala has already taken to prevent this West Nile virus? So district medical officers have been told to intensify the pre-monsoon cleaning drives. Now it is very important that we must carry out this cleaning drives. We should make sure that there is no stagnant water, because stagnant waters are very often the breeding ground for these mosquitoes. And they not only spread the West Nile virus, but they are also associated with several other diseases such as Zika virus and even dengue, malaria viruses. So therefore, the district medical officers have been told to intensify the pre-monsoon cleaning drives. And in fact, landfill sites are also very often the breeding grounds of these disease-causing or the disease-spreading mosquitoes. However, the district medical officers have to coordinate with the local self-governance institutions in this cleaning drives and even the respective administration, and this is how it is being directed to deal with the rapid spread of West Nile virus. And in fact, the infection confirmed after samples of blood and cerebrospinal fluid of suspected patients were examined, we get to know that these are the symptoms of West Nile virus. And in fact, this cerebrospinal fluid is a fluid around the brain or fluid around the spinal cord in invertebrates. And in fact, the World Health Organization also said that treatment is supportive for patients with neuroinvasive West Nile virus. So treatment is possible for any individual who is infected with this neuroinvasive West Nile virus. And in fact, the treatment very often involves hospitalization, intravenous fluids, respiratory support must be provided, and prevention of secondary infections must be focused in order to prevent the further spread of the West Nile virus. So please remember, the human to human contamination of this, the human to human transmission of this disease is not possible. Rather, mosquitoes can act as a host to transmit disease from one healthy individual, from one infected individual to a healthy individual. However, there is no vaccine available for humans to this West Nile virus. So please remember that at least one question is being asked every year in UPSC. So therefore you have to understand this. So which mosquito acts as a host, and secondly, whether vaccine is available for this particular disease, whether it is human to human contamination is possible or not. The transmission cycle of this West Nile virus is very, very important, and you can see some symptoms of this West Nile virus in this image. The next important news article is with respect to plastic pollution and what should be the solution for the plastic pollution. Now, if I can give you a brief detail about the plastic pollution. Now, plastic is produced widely across the world. However, contamination of plastic pollution of existing ecosystems, including soil pollution, water pollution, and even the atmospheric pollution, is most common. Now, how it pollutes the atmosphere or how it pollutes the air? Now, if we dump the plastic in a landfill and later the landfill is burnt, open firing of the landfill, so that could releases dangerous volatile organic compounds into the atmosphere. And in fact, these dangerous volatile organic compounds could also pose challenges to the ozone layer, and at the same time they also releases harmful gases and they cause health risks for the human beings. And in fact, they also pollute water and at the same time soil. And in fact, the microplastics in water is a most serious and most pressing concern. So because of these microplastics, problems like biomagnification and bioaccumulation have been taking place. So both biomagnification and bioaccumulation are serious challenges. So because of that reason, the plastic pollutants or microplastics are actually entering into the food chain. So through these two processes, the microplastics are actually entering into the food chain. And since they have been posing significant risks to human health, environmental health, and even degrading the existing biodiversity of different ecosystems, the plastic and plastic pollution poses significant concerns. Why plastic poses significant concerns? It is non-biodegradable in nature. Plastic is non-biodegradable in nature. So it never decomposes. Even if it decomposes, it takes thousands of years. So because of that reason, its non-biodegradable nature, it is still a concern. So therefore, all the countries are now looking to eliminate plastic or to reduce the use of plastic by bringing in alternatives to plastic. So if you can remember, India has already come up with single-use plastic ban. In fact, it is India's plan to gradually phase out plastic, because if you look at the countries, all the countries in the world, India is the largest, one of the largest producer of plastic. So therefore, India focused on gradually phasing out plastic, and its first step was to ban single-use plastic use in the year 2022. Now we'll understand this context. We have understood the consequences of plastic pollution. Now, what was the context of this particular editorial? The context is that recently a global plastic treaty was discussed and debated. And in fact, this global plastic treaty is known as one of the most ambitious treaties. So why? Because this particular treaty would deal with the plastic pollution, plastic production, and finding out alternatives, elimination of plastic over a period of time. Now we already have the climate change treaties. So those treaties deal with the climate change and desertification and several other things. So why don't we have a treaty on the global plastic pollution? So therefore, we can say that it is an ambitious initiative, and this initiative actually involves around 175 United Nations member countries. So we all knew that United Nations had a member countries of more than 193. So therefore, it is a treaty that is involving at least 175 United Nations member countries. Now, as part of the global plastic treaty, the overall objective is to eliminate the use of plastics and at the same time conclude its fourth round of negotiations recently. Okay, so it has recently concluded its fourth round of negotiations, but its objective is to eliminate the use of plastics. Now, the goal of this global plastic treaty, what was the goal of the global plastic treaty? So its goal is to finalize the legal document by the end of 2024. So it contains a legal document that basically mentions how the countries would gradually phase out the plastic and how can we deal with the plastic pollution. What about the technology transfer and financial transfers to developing countries and underdeveloped countries to cope up with the plastic pollution. So therefore, it is expected that the legal document would be completed by the end of 2024. And in fact, this legal document mentions countries must agree to curb the plastic pollution and at the same time eliminate the use of plastic, because the plastic has been creating waste and it has also been creating or releasing certain banned chemicals used in production and set targets for recycling, and all these factors are part of the global plastic treaty. Now there are certain hurdles within the global plastic treaty. So one such hurdle is economic hurdle, so availability of finances. Now if you look at the global climate change treaties, the developed countries pledged financial support to the developing countries, but even after they pledges, they are reluctant to provide financial support to developing countries and least developed countries. But when we have a global plastic treaty, what would be the economic means? How can we finance ambitious programs under this global plastic treaty? And in case, as part of capacity building of the developed countries and least developed countries, if it is required from the developed countries to transfer funds to the developing countries, so how can that be achieved? So all these are major questions, and one such major hurdle is the economic hurdle. So therefore, oil producing and refining countries, there are a lot of oil producing countries such as Saudi Arabia, United States, Russia, India. India is not an oil producing country, but rather India is a oil refining country. So India, Iran are actually reluctant about the hard deadlines to eliminate the plastic pollution. Now what is hard deadline? Hard deadline is one fixed deadline. So within that deadline, every country meet the objectives of the global plastic treaty. That is hard deadline. However, major oil producing countries and refining countries are actually objecting to this or reluctant about the hard deadlines to eliminate plastic production. And in fact, there was also a coalition of African countries, and though coalition of African countries are actually supported by several European nations in favor of a year around 2040 to ensure the timeline of reluctant reduction is in effect. Okay, so a coalition of African countries are actually supported by several European nations. These African countries are actually in favor of a year around 2040 to ensure a timeline for reduction of plastics. Okay, so that was the deadline 2040, but it is not yet fixed. However, India had also expressed its opinion with respect to the phasing out of plastic or setting out deadlines for the plastic pollution. So in fact, if you look at India's opinion, India was uncomfortable setting up these hard deadlines or setting up binding targets, because the legal binding instrument to end plastic pollution must also address several other issues. So what are those issues? So India has actually raised certain issues. So they are availability, accessibility and affordability of alternatives, including costs. Okay, so because when we are phasing out the plastic, it is also very important that we produce the sustainable alternatives, the biodegradable alternatives. So that is how India has emphasized on. Okay, so we must address the availability, accessibility and affordability of alternatives. So that including cost implications and specifying the arrangements. So one such arrangement that India has proposed was capacity building, technical assistance, technology transfer and financial assistance from developed countries to the developing countries and least developed countries. Because if you look at the developing countries, they lack finances and at the same time they also lack the technology. And if you fix the hard deadlines to phase out plastic, then the developing countries and least developed countries would not be able to meet those targets on time. However, in order to make sure those developing countries and least developed countries to meet the targets, it is very important that developed countries must provide technical assistance, financial support and technology transfer, all those things. And in fact, India is not only the only proponent, and in fact India has also been advocating for common but differentiated responsibility. So that was already enshrined in the climate talks. Okay, so what does this common but differentiated responsibilities? Now I'll explain you what is common but differentiated responsibilities. This is also known as CBDR. Now it is the common responsibility for every country to eliminate or phase out plastic. Okay, so eliminate or phase out plastic. So it is the common responsibility of every country. There is no doubt about that. Whether it is developed countries, developing country, or even least developed country. So every country has the responsibility to eliminate the plastic pollution. But on the other hand, the responsibility is differentiated responsibility. So differentiated responsibility in the sense that the developed countries would shoulder a greater burden of eliminating the plastic compared to the developing countries. Because if you look at the developing countries, these countries have a huge population, and most of the population have a lower per capita income, and most of them are in poverty, and at the same time there is a lack of adequate capacity, adequate financial resources and technology with respect to the poor underdeveloped countries. And because of that reason, the major responsibility to eliminate plastic should be taken up by the developed countries. And at the same time, the measures that are being taken by all the developing countries would complement the attempts of the developing countries to eliminate the plastics. However, the developed countries must support all the developing countries by providing technology, at the same time financial transfer, so that the developing countries could also be able to eliminate plastic pollution, and we will be able to meet the objectives of Global Plastic Treaty. Now, under this particular Global Plastic Treaty, countries must have a common target, but those more privileged must support others and take on stricter targets themselves. And this is in line with the common but differentiated responsibility. Now, if you can carefully read this, so you can clearly understand what exactly is common but differentiated responsibilities. So under this common but differentiated responsibilities, so countries must have a common target. Common target is eliminating or phasing out the plastic. But here, the more privileged countries, such as the developed countries, have the greater responsibility, and at the same time they should take on stricter targets themselves compared to the developing countries and least developed countries, and that is what is known as common but differentiated responsibility. So the first attempt to launch this treaty, the plastic treaty, was mooted in 2022. Okay, so initial attempts were made in 2022 to launch such a treaty, the plastic treaty, and it brought into effect in India Plastic Waste Management and Amendment Rules 2021. Okay, so India already brought the Plastic Waste Management and Amendment Rules 2021, and as part of this Plastic Waste Management and Amendment Rules, India banned 19 categories of single-use plastics. Okay, so under these rules, India already banned 19 categories of single-use plastics. And in fact, it does not include plastic bottles. So plastic bottles, certain plastics are not banned under the single-use plastic ban of India. For example, the plastic bottles which are less than 200 ml, and even the multi-layered packing boxes as milk cartons. So those plastics, even though they are single-use plastics, so they were not banned as part of this Plastic Waste Management and Amendment Rules 2021. And in fact, the ban on single-use plastic items is not uniformly enforced across the nation. So that is another problem, that we have not enforced this ban uniformly across the nation. And in fact, several outlets continuing to sell these plastic bags. Okay, so they are continuing to retail these plastic goods. So that is the problem. Even though we have come up with the ban on single-use plastic, several retailers have been using the single-use plastic. They are selling the single-use plastic, and that is a problem. Now, if you look at the global distribution of plastic pollution. So it is actually known as, it is considered as unequal distribution of plastic pollution. Why it is unequal? Because 4 countries, Brazil, China, India and US, responsible for around 60% of the plastic pollution compared to the other countries. So that is actually huge. 4 countries alone have been contributing to the 60% of the plastic pollution. So according to a data by non-profit Earth Action. Okay, so in this slide, I've given you a few negative impacts of plastic pollution on land. Now, I've already told you that with plastic pollution, the problem is that biomagnification and bioaccumulation have been taking place. And with biomagnification and bioaccumulation, what has been happening? The plastics, especially the bioplastics, have been entering into the food chain, the animal food chain, and even the human food chain also, thereby posing significant health risks to the human beings, and also it is leading to the death of several wild animals. So therefore plastic pollution has been declining, resulting in decline of biodiversity, and at the same time it has also been posing several risks to the environment. So apart from this, plastic pollution on land is both physical and chemical pollution. So if you look at the plastic pollution on land, it can reduce the soil fertility by forming the part of manure for years. And after that, plastic also spoils environmental aesthetics and even the hygiene of the area. So plastics on landfills emits hazardous volatile organic compounds during incineration. So incineration actually means open burning or controlled burning of the waste. So that releases volatile organic compounds into the atmosphere, and these volatile organic compounds have a lot of negative impacts on the environment. So the plastics in soil can also lessen the growth of plants and trees by blocking the absorption of minerals, water and other nutrients, and plastics can also cause landslides. So all these are the negative consequences which are being associated with the plastic pollution on land. So therefore, transitioning away from the fossil fuels. Now one thing is that with the use of fossil fuels we can produce plastics, and at the same time fossil fuels, after burning, they also release greenhouse gases, and that further contributing to the increasing global temperatures. So therefore, transitioning away from the fossil fuel actually invites its own challenges. Okay, so it creates its own challenges. So therefore, plastic pollution cannot be ended by merely signing a treaty. So just simply signing a treaty doesn't mean that we can end the plastic pollution in a very near future. But rather, it requires strong political will from different countries. And at the same time, plastic pollution should be part of the public discourse. Debates and discussions about the plastic pollution among the people from the grassroots level is very, very important to phase out, gradually eliminate the use of plastic. And after that, it is also very, very important that we must have alternatives to the plastics, and these alternatives must be cost effective. Okay, so that they can be able to compete with the plastics. And at the same time, the governments must also look to enforce the ban on single-use plastic in letter and spirit, and that is also very, very important. For example, when we talk about the alternatives to plastic, jute bags can be an alternative to the plastic, but the problem is that jute bags are more costly compared to the plastic bags. So all these problems have been creating challenges for phasing out the plastic, and therefore there is a need for much greater investments in alternative products, and we must make them affordable before realizing or realistic targets are decided upon as part of the global plastic treaty. And at the same time, if any such treaty comes up, it is very important that the developed countries must support all the developing countries to develop their capacities. Okay, so developed countries must support all the developed countries. Developed countries must support all the developing countries to further develop the capacities. So how can they support them? They can support by providing financial assistance, and they can also provide them with the technology transfer. So all these factors would result in significantly improving the capacities of the developing countries. Thereby we will be able to meet the phasing out the targets which are set under the Global Plastic Treaty in the future. So the next important article is with respect to the inheritance tax. Now in recent times there is a debate in India with respect to growing inequalities, concentration of wealth, and that has resulted in inequalities, regional inequalities, income inequalities, wealth inequalities that are growing at a faster pace. So in this context, the inheritance tax was also in news. Now we'll understand what exactly is this inheritance tax. Okay, so inheritance tax is actually a tax or state tax that is being levied on the value of inherited assets. For example, imagine that one person earned a lot of money, and after that the wealth of, for example, person A earned a wealth of 100 crore, and after person A, the wealth would be inherited to person B. So person B was son of the person A. Okay, so he would inherit the property of his father, 100 crore. Okay, so now the state levies tax on the inheritance of this 100 crore, and that is known as the inheritance tax. I hope you have understood what exactly is the inheritance tax. For example, your father earned a lot of money, and one day you will inherit the property of your father, and state would levy a certain sum of tax, a certain amount of tax on the inheritance of yours. So that is known as inheritance tax. The tax levied on the value of inherited assets paid by the inheritor. In this case, B would be the inheritor, and B would pay the inheritance tax rather than estate of a deceased. Right? So in case, if you look at India, we do not have any such inheritance tax, but there are demands that inheritance tax must be implemented in India, because this inheritance tax would reduce the amount of inequalities in India. Now, what was the context? So the context is that on implementing the inheritance tax as a tool of wealth redistribution. So once the state, imposes the inheritance tax, and inheritee would pay the tax, or inheritor would pay the tax to the state, and that would result in a redistribution of the tax or redistribution of the wealth. And in fact, it has sparked a massive debate across the country. And in this editorial, the author have been discussing about why high inequality is harmful for the society, harmful for the country. And so what exactly is the progressive tax, and how this progressive tax as a mechanism would be useful in reducing inequalities in the society. And in fact, if you look at India, a very few individuals, it is said that around 1% of the individuals have owned more than 40% of India's national wealth. 40% of national wealth is owned by just 1% of the individuals. Okay, so therefore a handful of dominant individuals, in this case 1% of rich wealthy individuals in India, can actually wield a disproportionate amount of power through control of resources. Now they can control the resources since they have a significant wealth that is being concentrated in the very less number of people. So therefore they can also control the resources and also control the amount. They can also wield a disproportionate amount of power in their hands. And in fact, the citizenship of wealthy elites would then carry more weight than the majority of the country, and this is ethically hazardous. For example, all of us are citizens, whether it is 1% or remaining 99%, everyone are citizens. But now if you look at the wealthy elite citizens of 1%, they actually carry more weight in different matters, whether political matters, social matters, and economic matters. The aristocracy, the rich 1%, would wield a lot of power compared to the remaining 99% of the citizens. So therefore having such a disparities, having such inequalities in wielding power would be ethically hazardous. So this is what the authors have been talking about. Now, what will be the impact of inequality? So wealth inequality and income inequality, and how these disparities would impact a country. In fact, inequality basically harms the growth of the country in the medium to long term. Okay, fine, it is in the short term, these inequalities can be fine, but in the long term, these inequalities would have serious consequences because they can impact growth in the medium to long term. So when they impact growth in the longer term, medium term, so that will also hamper the productivity of the nation, and it would also reduces the labor incomes because the now wealth is being concentrated. Even though these laborers are being working, the conditions will not be improved, the living standards will not be improved because more and more wealth is being concentrated. In India, if you look at the statistics, rich are becoming more rich and poor are becoming more poor. And in fact, it is also lead to the diversion of resources and rights of the people away from provisions such as education and healthcare. So most of these services can be enjoyed by the rich aristocratic class, but on the other hand, the conditions of the poor people continues to deteriorate, and that could create a social strife, social unrest, and that could even lead to the civil war like conditions. Okay, so therefore, for the stability of any country in the longer term, inequalities or equality in the society, social equality, economic equality, and political equality is very, very important here. And if you look at the unequal countries, countries which have a huge amount of inequalities, so the place of birth actually hold the inordinate power in directing the later lifetime outcomes. Now, imagine that there are two individuals, person A and person B. And person A born in a rich family, and person B was born in a poor family. Okay, so now imagine how these both citizens can influence of which one have more weight, which one have more power in the system. Of course, citizen A, because he was born in a rich family. So therefore, the place of birth actually holds inordinate power in directing the lifetime outcomes. So lifetime outcomes in the sense that, for example, he can have a best education, best healthcare services. Okay, so he can enjoy the resources of this nation in a better manner. But on the other hand, the poor people, a poor individual may not be able to have a best education, best healthcare access, and he also have a lesser rights over the resources of the country. Okay, so that would lead to the increasing number of poor people in our country. Okay, so now if you look at India, almost third of the variation in the consumption can be explained by the place of residence, the state and city, even village. Now, high inequality is also associated with the political polarization and increased conflict. So if you look at the countries which have a higher inequalities, the wealth inequalities, income inequalities, political, social and economic inequalities, so you can clearly see the political polarization among the people, and also there are chances that could even lead to the conflicts, the social strife among the people, the disaffection among the people over the inability of the state to reduce these inequalities. And in fact, the inequality likely to have a negative multiplier effect on the economy. Now, how inequality would have a negative multiplier effect? Because it could diminish the earnings of the poor, and it would lead to the reduced consumption from the people, and reduced consumption and reduced savings means reduced demand in the economy, and at the same time increased indebtedness. So everything is linked here. Okay, so everything is linked in this context. So therefore, now understand that, imagine a country where there are higher levels of inequality. where there are higher levels of inequality and wealth is not evenly distributed across the country. Now, in those countries, there are higher number of poor people. Higher number of poor people. Now, imagine India that we have 1% holding 40% of the resources and 50%, bottom 50% actually holding less than 10% of the resources, less than 10% of the country's resources. Now, in this case, if you look at the bottom 50% of India's population, so population is more, but on the other hand, their income share or wealth share is very less. So since their income share and wealth share is very less, it in fact have impact on the revenues of the state, the tax revenues of the state, because the poor and middle are the ones who pay higher taxes. Okay, so it impacts the tax revenues, and since they have a lesser income, the demand from the middle and poor classes would go down. Okay, so lesser demand in the economy. So lesser demand in the sense that there would not be enough production in the economy because of lesser demand. So lesser demand would also leads to the laying offs or unemployment and indebtedness, and poor will remain poor because of all these factors. So this is how the wealth inequality or income inequality in any country impacting the overall social economic progress of the individuals. And in fact, the wealth inequalities also reduces the aggregate demand. It limits production and even investment. So when there was no demand in the economy, then no investor would ready to invest his capital because of lack of demand. Okay, so any investor invests his capital with the hope that he would he would earn a lot of profit. But there was no demand in the economy, then there will be lesser investment and lesser production, and this would lead to the lower growth rates in the future. And since India is a country with the highest demographic dividend, it is also very important for us that we should have a higher investments, higher demand, higher production. So therefore we must work on reducing these wealth inequalities. Now if you look at agriculture laborers in last one decade, so they grow by 6.8% between 2004 to 2014. So this is how the agricultural laborers are being increasing. Now we are actually making plans to shift excess number of people out of the agriculture sector into either manufacturing sector or service sector. But here the agricultural laborers number has increased in the last decade. And inequality during growth is actually inevitable in any economy, any functional economy. This inequality is inevitable, but priority should be given towards reducing the poverty. Okay, so those levels of inequality should not be very high, and we must identify and recognize the poor and ensure all the benefits to these poor so that we can reduce the levels of poverty. And in fact, Indian Constitution, especially Article 14, Article 15 and Article 16 talks about the equality of status and equality of opportunity for all the citizens. So we must look forward in the spirit of the Constitution, in the spirit of the fundamental rights, that every individual or every citizen must be provided equal status and equal opportunity, and we must strive to reduce the inequalities in the economy. So especially Article 39B and Article 39C of the Directive Principles of State Policy. Now in this context, we'll briefly talk about the inheritance tax also. So a wealth tax is actually a recurring tax. So recurring tax means a continuous tax on all physical and financial assets that an individual holds. Okay, so wealth tax is actually a recurring tax on all physical and financial assets that an individual owns. And an inheritance tax differs from the wealth tax in two ways. So how inheritance tax differs from the wealth tax? Firstly, the inheritance tax is actually the intergenerational, because the inheritor need to pay the inheritance tax. Okay, so therefore it is intergenerational, from one generation to another generation. If property is inherited, then the inheritor have to pay the inheritance tax, and at the same time this is levied once in a lifetime, unlike the wealth tax, which is recurring in nature, which is continuous in nature, but inheritance tax is actually levied once in a lifetime. And in fact, these taxes, the inheritance taxes, are meant to be applied to individuals having high wealth above the threshold. And after that, these taxes, the inheritance taxes, actually reduces the concentration of wealth in the hands of few, and at the same time it also helps in shifting focus or shifting wealth towards investments from non-productive sectors to more productive sectors or productive activities. मुलाय 2 मिनट आ रहा हूँ. So revenue generated from the inheritance tax can be used to fund diversified set of innovations. An advanced country like Japan has 55% of the inheritance tax. Okay, so a variant of the inheritance tax called estate duty was levied on India in 1953-1985. But now we do not have any such inheritance tax, and it is being abolished owing to the administrative costs. Okay, so the land value cost, LVT. So this tax the rental value of land without considering the property built on it. Okay, so the role of land ownership in perpetuating the in rural areas, the land ownership, excessive land ownership, is actually perpetuating the feudal caste relations. So therefore it has also resulted in pervasive political builder nexus in urban India. So therefore this LVT, land value tax, is useful for redistributive mechanism, and we should also ensure a bucket of social and economic rights such as living wages, right to wealth, employment, and food for the poor people. So that is how we can deal with the wealth inequalities. Okay.